Our guest today is Dr. Grady Dixon. He is the Dean of the Werth College of Science, Technology, and Mathematics. And without further ado, let's welcome him. And Grady, what I'd like for you to do, and as I mentioned to you earlier, I think it's going to be pretty obvious as soon as you start speaking that you are not a native Kansan. So tell us about your background and what brought you to Hayes America.
Yeah, thanks, Charlene. I get told by some folks that I sound like I'm from the South as soon as I speak, and other people claim they never hear it. Compared to my wife, I don't think I have that much of an accent because I've been teaching for 20 years, and years ago I realized that if I wanted my students to understand what I was actually saying, I had to enunciate the ends of my words and slow it down a little bit. So maybe you'll hear it, maybe you won't. My wife and I, Melissa Dixon is my wife, we both grew up in a town called Vicksburg, Mississippi. It's a big Civil War history town right on the Mississippi River on the Louisiana border, where Interstate 20 cuts across the middle of Mississippi. We both went to Mississippi State University for our bachelor's degrees, and that's where I studied meteorology. I went to school there originally planning on majoring in engineering and took an intro to meteorology course and was hooked my freshman semester. From there, I went to graduate school at University of Georgia, and then Melissa and I got married during that time. And then we went together to Phoenix, Arizona, where I attended Arizona State University for my PhD. And after that, we went back to Mississippi. My first faculty job was at Mississippi State University, which was unbelievable. I mean, that was kind of what because you don't know any better, you hope to go back and work at your alma mater. And so we thought we were home forever. And I worked there for 9 years, and she had a graphic design business in downtown. We really enjoyed the town and still have lots of great friends there. But we had kids and started thinking that wasn't really the place we wanted to have them grow up. And for our entire marriage and then some, I had been coming out to the Great Plains every year to look at storms. I'd come out some with friends on vacation, and then I started leading classes, lead groups of students from Mississippi State. We'd come out here for 2 weeks at a time. And I just really fell in love with this part of the country. And I used to tell her all the time about how much I liked Hayes. She'd never been here. And I think the first time she ever spent the night here was to come and look for a house. Or no, it was for my job interview. She came with me, she and the kids. And no regrets. I mean, she's now the director of the Hayes Convention and Visitors Bureau. So she's a walking, talking Hayes billboard, and we love every minute of it.
So tell us a little bit more about when you first came. You were a faculty member in geosciences, or did you come as chair?
I was hired as a department chair.
Okay.
It was, I was casually looking to get out of Mississippi, but we were happy enough. There wasn't any rush, and a job opening appeared at a rather unusual time. Dr. John Heinrichs passed away unexpectedly in January of 2014. And so that left that department in a tough spot. And so the job ad really caught my attention because of the odd timing, but also because of the location. I just thought, oh my God, I never thought I'd have a chance to work at Fort Hayes because they didn't have a meteorology program. But then they had this chair opening in a department where I could certainly have a home, and everything just kind of fell into place.
So tell us about your past storm chasing, what you're out looking for, and just how that works. I mean, you hear about storm chasers, and you certainly see them on Weather Channel starting about this time of the year, it seems like, but I personally don't know a whole lot about how you figure out where you need to be and all of that. So, and how you stay safe. Because I remember, not that long ago, a couple of the Weather Channel guys, were in a pretty serious accident, right?
Yes. I mean, I would say there are days where every chaser feels like they don't know how it works. Sometimes it comes together and sometimes it does not. I first went out in 1998, and assuming that I don't go out this year, this will be the first year since 99 that I haven't spent at least 2 weeks organized traveling around the Great Plains, wherever the storms are. A lot of chasers, I can't speak for other folks. I don't know why they do it. there's usually this false narrative of they do it for public safety and all that stuff. And those people almost don't exist. If you go through the trouble to do this, it is a selfish endeavor, and that's okay. Along the lines, you get to report some stuff to the Weather Service and end up maybe helping contribute to the warning process. That's great, but you're not putting in this amount of time and frustration and stress and money simply out of that service, I don't think. At least that's not what I observe. The reason I've been doing it all these years is because I love doing it. I love to travel. I love waking up in the morning and knowing that I have nothing to do except go see a storm. I don't care where I have to go. I don't care what state I'm in. I don't care what I eat. My only job is to go look at a storm. That's an unbelievable opportunity that most of us never get to do. Even when we're on vacation, we usually have some sort of schedule and we're pulled every different direction. So I think that's great. I love seeing the weather. But I've always taken students, well, not always, I guess for the last, since like 03, 04, I've always taken students along. And that's done a couple of things. One, it's tempered my thrill seeking. If I've got a bunch of new folks in the van, I'm not willing to push the envelope and scare the heck out of them. Plus, every time I see something that is pretty mundane, that I see every year, they lose their minds. And that keeps me excited. So I continue to get a thrill out of seeing the same old stuff. And, making the same jokes and taking them to the same locations that previous students have been, but it's all new for them. So that's really exciting. The process is, it's not that complex these days. We don't have a bunch of contraptions on our vehicle. If we passed you on the highway, you would think we were any old field trip from the university or maybe a church camp or something. I mean, we're just a unmarked white van, no antennas, just a laptop and some wireless data. That's all we need. And so we make a forecast every morning in the hotel. We have a target that we're trying to get to. The goal is to get there before the storms start. And sometimes you make it, sometimes you're a little late, but usually you get there before they start. You hang out in a city park or something and watch the towers bubble up. And then once that first one goes, you get in position so that you can safely follow it. The chase is on, and the rest of the day, you're kind of stair-stepping along the county roads, trying to stay a few miles in front, really kind of off to the side, not in front of that storm. And if it's moving slowly enough, you stop and let the students get out and explain what's going on and all that kind of stuff. It can be really quite enjoyable. Sometimes it's a little more difficult to get out because of lightning and the storms are moving too quickly, and that's a little more stressful. But sometimes it's birds chirping and we're stopped and pointing, and it's like I said, quite relaxed. It's not the thrill that you see on TV where people are screaming and slamming it in reverse and all that kind of stuff.
Well, the joke about Kansans, when there's a tornado, is you grab a beer and go to the porch so you can watch what's going on, right? So that kind of sounds a little similar, I think, to some of us, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, in a place like Kansas, you've got two things going for you that make that possible. That whole, let's go outside and take a peek. Tornado sirens are going off. Let's look outside. One, the tornadoes happen almost exclusively during daylight hours. It's a big advantage. And most of the tornadoes that happen in Kansas move pretty slowly. They're 30 miles an hour or less. So you have time to go outside. The official advice is to never go outside when you hear a warning. You take cover immediately, because in a lot of parts of the country, pretty much anywhere east of Kansas City, storms happen at night. So going outside is not going to help. There's trees. So even if it was daytime, you couldn't see them anyway. And they're moving at 60 miles an hour sometimes. And so, at twice or sometimes 5 or 6 times the speed we see here in Kansas, you don't have that luxury of taking a few steps outside. Every second is really crucial for folks, especially in the deep South in the winter months and stuff like that. But yeah, around here, I would say you're not crazy if you step outside and take a look first. Put your eyes on it and really get a good idea as to whether or not you're in danger. Because if you can see it, then you know when the threat is over as well. And if you can see that it's heading toward you, then you suddenly have a whole lot of more motivation to definitely go into that basement or across the yard and get into that kind of damp, smelly old storm cellar.
So until just now, I didn't realize that tornadoes acted differently in different parts of the country. I mean, that they're
That's
more
been a big
nighttime?
part of my research is trying to get that message across to people that, you know, it's not so much about the part of the country you're in, it's more really about the season. So occasionally Kansas will get tornadoes, say in November. Pretty unusual. And when it happens, they go a long way. They're on the ground for a long time. And it has to do with the types of storms that produce the tornadoes. And in the winter, the storms just move faster. There's more energy in them. And typically, you're not going to get tornadoes in Kansas in the winter or even in the late fall because there's not enough humidity and stuff. You get them down in the south. So Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama. They get them. Their tornado season basically starts in October and runs all the way through April. And so they're constantly getting those fast moving storms. Well, if you have a tornado on the ground in Kansas for 10 minutes, you know, it might go 2 miles. You have that same tornado on the ground in Mississippi for 10 minutes, it's probably gone 10 or 15 miles. And probably not 15, but it's gone quite a ways. And so it may have hit 2 towns where the one in Kansas may have just sat in an open field. That's the big difference between those regions that I see. And that's one reason I don't chase storms in the Southeast. Even if you could find some open spots with few trees, which they exist, they're just moving so quickly. I mean, if you're trying to chase a storm moving 60 diagonally across the roads and you're trying to stair step with it, you're never going to have a chance unless you were doing some serious speeding.
So back to what you were talking about previously with you just be in a plain white van and no one would really know that so you're telling me that the whole thing from Twister with Dorothy and the balls going up in the air and all that, that's just movie magic? Is that what you're saying?
To some extent, the Twister, a lot of people love to hate on the movies that are not as accurate as real life. I think Twister's a fine movie. You know, there's some things that are not realistic about it, but it does a decent job of exposing, especially in 1996. You know, it really shows people a condensed version of what, say, 2 weeks of storm chasing is like. They just happened to do that 2 weeks of chasing in like 12 hours. And there was a thing like Dorothy, that you know, big bucket full of sensors they had. There were researchers back in late 80s, early 90s, I think, that had something called TOTO. It wasn't Dorothy. It stood for the Total Tornado Observatory. And they tried to make that work. It never got off the ground, figuratively or literally. But there were people trying to do that stuff. You know, there were lots of meteorologists that were hired to consult on the visuals for that movie. And when they shared some of their videos back in the day and photographs, the producers of the movie said, this stuff isn't believable. We can put these actual videos on here and people are going to think it's fake. So they faked the videos in the movie to make them look less scary, to make them look less out of this world than the real thing they actually are. So every now and then, whenever you see, like last August when we had that stretch of severe weather, there were a few photos of these big spaceship-looking clouds coming into haze. That's pretty common, but you didn't see that on the movie.
So cool. So we have a couple questions for you that have come in. Every tornado that I have been through, 3 close calls, were all at night when it was completely dark. I hear the exclusive to daylight hours, but my experience in Northwest Kansas has been tornadoes at night. So does that, I guess that's not really
very rare.
Okay.
They certainly happen, without a doubt. I mean, and it's not an insignificant percentage of tornadoes that happen in Kansas will happen at night. But usually, if you're going to have a tornado at night, you've already had a couple of dozen during the day. Usually you've got ongoing storms that have been producing tornadoes for quite a while and continue into the night. Greensburg was after dark. I mean, so one of the most infamous tornadoes in U.S. history was in western Kansas, and it was totally dark. So it certainly happens. But that, again, had been a pretty big day. That storm had been on the ground that storm had been ongoing for a couple hours at that point. Not the tornado part itself, but the parent storm was, for sure. So it's not unheard of. If you compare Kansas to somewhere like, say, Tennessee, over 40% of Tennessee's tornadoes happen after dark. Or I think Kansas is probably 18, 20%, something like that.
So I don't know that everyone on our Zoom meeting here knows that we're in the presence of someone whose research was recently published in the Washington Post. there was recently an article, and you were certainly one of the researchers that they talked to, or referenced your research anyway, regarding how maybe Tornado Alley is not an accurate phrase as we think about it, coming up through Texas and through Kansas, that maybe we should be thinking about those folks in the Southeast. So do you want to share what was in that article?
Yeah, this is an area of research I've been doing for about a decade now. And basically, once our computing technology was good enough to start producing maps where we could make probability maps based on tornado paths, full length tracks. Because prior to that, and actually still a lot of times today, people just plot the starting location of a tornado and say, that's the record. That's where the tornado happened. Well, if it's, I've been on tornadoes that lasted for an hour and never moved more than a mile or two. They were completely stationary. In that case, that's a good representation. Those are very rare. Most tornadoes, they move somewhere. And like I said, in the East, a lot of times they move several miles. And so when this paper came out, it was back in 2011. It came out in April 2011. It got picked up by USA Today because we had highlighted all these paths rather than just the points. And what we saw was that the greatest risk to people in the United States was in the Deep South. It was actually, not that you can put too fine of a point on it because these things change with time, but it was in South Central Mississippi, this little county called Smith County. And so this made the USA Today. It was a very, publicly consumable piece of research, and it was at the beginning of storm season, and it came out and had a lot of attention. And so CNN called and wanted to do a live report. And this was so interesting. It was April 26th, 2011. I got bumped. I sat in the studio at Mississippi State University, and they were ready to ask me these questions for a live interview with, I forget the name of the little TV show on CNN. And I got bumped by Donald Trump. He had some big news about Obama's birth certificate or some craziness back then. And, it was so funny. I was sitting there being annoyed by this guy. And then they finally said, we're out of time. Like we've had to cover Donald Trump. It's like, okay, well, I guess I'll go back to my office. And this was a wasted afternoon. And the next day was historic tornado outbreak. April 27th, 2011 was the Tuscaloosa, Alabama tornado that had all these EF5s and everything. And so then I had to come on again the day after that, 2 days after I got bumped. And gosh, I don't want this to sound like this was a good thing, but it was an interesting coincidence that I didn't get to go on that one day and I got to go on the day after and talk about the relevance of that research. It had been like a big flare warning going out to people that, look, the Southeast is at great risk of tornadoes. And the people that 2 days before had been kind of saying, this guy's from Mississippi, he's just trying to get funding for his state and his university, this research isn't accurate. Suddenly it had a lot more power to it. And so ever since then, anytime anybody does research talking about the vulnerability of the South, it gets quite a bit of press. And that's what happened the other day. It was a new reporter. This guy was a fresh graduate. I think he's like 24 years old. He came across that old paper and wanted to talk about it. He wrote the paper, same old story, same old data. I made one new map for him, and it's still got quite a bit of engagement. People are still surprised and intrigued, and sometimes want to argue about that narrative that Kansas is a great place to see tornadoes and to study tornadoes. But if you want to be in the most danger from tornadoes, go spend some time in North Mississippi, North Alabama, places like that.
And who doesn't want to be in the most danger from tornadoes, right?
Hey, we made the decision to get the heck out of there. As much as I love storms, that became a real negative part of my life. I took no joy in having severe weather happen in Mississippi because you knew somebody was going to get hurt. It happened almost every time. And, we had debris falling in our yard one time from a massive tornado about 10 miles south of us. It was just like, why do we live here? There's so many. This is just one piece of why we don't like living here. But this is one that we know better. Like we can find a place that's that's safer for us. There's no basements in Mississippi either. So you're just you're vulnerable. You know, my wife and I would always just get in the vehicle because I had enough insight into how the storms were moving. We would get out of the way. And our neighbors, bless their heart, would always just like stand at their window watching. And if my vehicle left during a tornado warning, they filed in line behind me. Well, that's not safe. You don't want a caravan of cars driving down the road. So we always struggled with what to do about that.
That is a challenge. You know, I'm from Chapman, and of course Chapman was hit by a tornado a few years back, and Chapman is also on the Smoky Hill River. And so as they were rebuilding from the tornado, they were telling some people, I'm sorry, you can't have a basement because it's now in a floodplain. So, but you know, basements are what saved people in the tornado. So it's an interesting challenge that my hometown dealt with, for sure.
At the risk of sounding like a narcissist, that Chapman Tornado is one of my greatest blunders while leading storm chasing classes. That storm initiated just northwest of Salina. We ate lunch in Salina. We hung out in a city park for 2.5 hours in Salina, and I got antsy and drove all the way down to El Dorado. And right about the time we got down there, that storm fired up near Salina and tracked through Chapman. And it was such an easy, obvious target looking back that morning. Like I said, we drove to Salina. That was our initial setup. Right. And I don't even remember what pulled me away. It was something that I always teach my students to, stick with your original plan and all that stuff. Messed it up. So that was, I believe yesterday was the anniversary of that. So I got lots of reminders on social media of all the people that had really interesting experiences that day.
Yes. And the people that I know who had interesting experiences would be the different kind of interesting, but
exactly.
Yeah, that was my experience with that. Not that anyone cares, is that I saw there were some storms coming up, went to bed, didn't think anything about it, and woke up the next morning to see a bunch of TV cameras in my hometown and my hometown demolished. So that was weird too. Okay, we've got another question here. I've heard that there's a 7-year rotation of where the prominent storms will be each year. For example, they may be in Missouri one year, Kansas in another, Iowa in another. Is there any truth to that?
Gosh, in weather and a lot of science, you try to never say never or always. So I don't want to say that there's no truth to that, but it certainly is not that simple. And there's nothing special about 7 years. What we do see is that there are things beyond the Great Plains that affect, at least partially, the weather that happens in the Great Plains. And so everybody's pretty familiar with the idea of El Nino, that warm waters in the equatorial Pacific Ocean can have some pretty significant impacts with the continental U.S. Well, there's a couple of other noteworthy patterns like that. And they have various scales. So El Nino is a multi-year process, or at least about a year. One year you may have an El Nino, the next year it may be a cold La Nina, and so forth. Then there's something called the Madden-Julian oscillation, which has a scale in the order of a few days. I mean, it moves around the globe every couple of months. So as it's moving across your part of the world, it can affect you in just a few days. And then there's other various oscillations of intermediate scales between that of a year and a few days. And so if you combine all those together, you can get more than 50% of your storm season explained. But it's so complex. It's so difficult to keep track of these oscillations because we don't have data collecting instruments all around the globe, especially over the oceans. So we do a pretty good job of trying to track that. That's one of the biggest areas of research right now that I'm envious about, is that seasonal tornado forecast. Right now, within about 5 days, we've got a pretty good idea of the chances, across a couple of states. But beyond that, we have no clue. And so they are starting to make some progress on predicting, say, 6 or 8 weeks out as to, you wouldn't be able to predict whether or not a storm is going to happen in Kansas, but you might at least be able to predict the activity across the Great Plains or across the Ohio River Valley or something like that. So we're getting there. But yeah, the simple answer is no, there's no regular pattern. It's no 7 years on, it's no 30 years on and off. There's starting to be what looks like a bit of an oscillation in the tornado data that would be on the scale of about 15 years. That's probably unnatural. It's probably related to something that humans are doing. We just don't know. I mean, we've got about 70 years of tornado data, but really only about 35 of those are what I'd consider even close to being quality data. So we don't know a ton about what happens long term.
Are there any myths about tornadoes that you would like to dispel?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned Chapman earlier and you talked about the river, I thought we were going a different direction. I'm glad you mentioned the basement, because water tables and rivers do affect basement placement. They do not affect tornadoes. Tornadoes are not attracted to streams. They're not influenced really at all. I mean, for a body of water to affect a tornado or a thunderstorm, you're going to have to be talking about something at least the size of Lake Michigan. Nothing we have in Kansas could have any effects. Terrain has some, and there is some evidence that a little bit of terrain can initiate thunderstorms and perhaps even strengthen them. Tornadoes that are going slightly downhill might have a little bit of a very subtle increase in intensity and things like that. But these are all such small percentage factors. They're not going to take an otherwise wimpy storm and turn it into a monster. These are mostly imperceptible differences for folks like you and me, just out in our yard watching the storms. The antennas southwest of Hayes on the university farm, it's this big array of antennas out there southwest of the rodeo grounds. And it's called a radar. It's not a weather radar. It's owned by Virginia Tech University, and it looks way up above where weather happens. It's basically in space, in the ionosphere. And so they call it space weather. It's part of a big array across the country, and we are one location that Virginia Tech operates in cooperation with some folks at Fort Hays. Gavin Buffington in physics is the point person on that. Well, depending on what the weather is doing, I get people convinced that is affecting it. Whenever we're in a drought, they tell me that radar instrument is keeping the rain away. Whenever we had big storms last August, they were telling me that it was because of that radar. None of that's true. I mean, they look like just a bunch of metal poles, because that's what they are. They are not affecting the weather at all in this part of the country, or anywhere else for that matter. Likewise, the hill that they're sitting on, the hill southwest of Hayes, the only effect it has on the weather is that it hurts my ability to see it coming. It doesn't strengthen the storms or weaken the storms. Like I said, if a tornado were happening on the other side of that hill, when it came down the hill, it might increase its intensity a few miles per hour, but that's really about it.
One of the things that I heard some people in Chapman say after, Chapman again, river, there are bluffs, Indian Hills, and some bluffs nearby. And I heard some people say, now I never heard this growing up, but some people were saying, well, Chapman, I'm surprised Chapman got hit because there are the hills. It's kind of in a valley. There are hills around it. It's like, how is, so that's why I asked that question.
Yes, it's a great question. Everybody thinks that.
Yeah.
Hayes has been hit by plenty of tornadoes, just had been lucky and never had a really damaging one. And that's key. All it takes is one that's strong enough and hits buildings for people to remember it.
Absolutely. So we haven't talked about anything that's going on in the STEM college. Are there any new exciting initiatives going on in the Werth College that you want to share with us?
There's a number of things depending on your level of interest. I could go on for quite a while. Just the transition we had in the spring, and then the planning that's being done for the fall is stuff that makes me really proud. I'm not sure how interesting that is to the wide audience, but I do want to share that when it was obvious back in March that we were going to have to move everything online, I took a quick audit of all of our classes in the college and came away thinking we're going to have about a third of our classes that are going to have to give incompletes. We have so many field trips and lab classes. I didn't think we could do it. And the faculty were amazing. I mean, it was, I forget the exact dates. It seems like it was so long ago, but basically on a Thursday, we told faculty, you need to be ready to be online after spring break. And they spent that weekend, they were going into labs and they were performing the experiments and filming each other, performing them and narrating them so they could turn around and put them online the next week for the students so that they could switch so quickly. And when the dust settled, we had 5 courses, 5 total that, I think there were only 50 students that were affected that had to give incompletes. We did a marvelous job of moving online. Now that doesn't speak at all to the students' challenges, and some of them maybe had to take incompletes for various reasons, but in terms of courses that couldn't be delivered, we got them almost all done. So I thought that was really cool. I mean, it's not like it was classes that already had an online presence. These were courses that we had always said shouldn't be offered online and can't be offered online, but in a crisis situation, Fort Hays folks reacted pretty well. More normal, brag-worthy type things. We hired, I want to say 13 people this spring. A lot of new faces coming in this summer. Challenging times to move to Hays, and so I'm going to be spending a lot of my time over the next couple of months kind of rah-rah, getting them excited and telling them all the great things there are to do here. And I'm going to be putting their faces in front of as many of you as I can to tell you about where they're coming from and what kind of stuff they do. We've got computer science is just growing like crazy. And so we hired an advisor and a new faculty member in computer science. And the most interesting thing about that is computer science jobs are everywhere. It's so easy if you're a computer science major to get a job wherever you want. And we just hired a lady who got her PhD at KU. She is from Kansas. She's a native Kansan, PhD, computer science, wants to stay in Kansas and work at Fort Hays. And so I was telling her about some things in Hays. And I said, surely you've got some high school colleagues or somebody that went to Fort Hays and you can ask them about it. She said, oh, I know all about it. She said, both my parents are alums. She said, my uncle was Jerry Tomanek. And so she is already, black and gold through and through, even though she never went to school here. And so that was something that got me pretty excited.
That's great. That her uncle was Jerry Tomanek. We definitely need to talk to her for sure. Absolutely. So does anyone, we're at our half-hour time. So does anyone have any questions that they want to ask before we wrap up? I am not seeing anyone waving at me. So now Grady. Gary is waving at me now. Okay. All right, Gary, I'm trying to unmute you. It's not working from my end. I think you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
There you go.
I have 2 questions, Grady. One,
yes, sir.
You mentioned several times in talking about the storm chasing a white van. Whatever happened to that tank-like vehicle that was around? I saw it in Hays a couple of times. Looked like something out of Star Wars. Is that still in use?
There's been a few of those. There were 2 groups that did that. One was a filmmaker out of Los Angeles, and he went through 2 or 3 of those. One started off as a big gray tank.
Yeah.
It broke down in Liebenthal. Oh gosh, it's been a dozen years or more. And he just asked this woman down there if he could put it in her barn. He'd come back and get it. He never did. It's still in a barn in Liebenthal. And then the next one he built, he used that for a few years, and then he made his movie and he stopped chasing. And so I'm not sure where the other vehicle is. Then there was another group. It was a meteorologist. He's the one that's still real active, Reed Timmer. He's got a high profile on TV and social media. He's basically got an SUV covered in armor, so it's not quite as elaborate as the other one. But he's still out and about. He'll come. He was in Hays about a week ago, passing through doing his thing. He works for AccuWeather out of Pennsylvania and does a lot of media for them.
I have one other question. Have you ever had a real urge to request a ride in a hurricane plane? One of the hurricane hunters?
I think I would still like to do that. I've been in a number of hurricanes, and I've got 2 former students who are hurricane hunters. They're the Air Force Reserves, and they fly those planes through the storms all summer long. I'm not what I'd call an experienced aviator or anything. I've never tried to fly a plane, and I don't mind turbulence, but I hear it's pretty intense riding through a hurricane.
Thank you.
It's like a real life roller coaster.
Yeah.
So hurricanes will be our next topic. How about that? Because
There
I
you
bet
go.
we could talk just as long about hurricanes. And I used to live in Florida, so I can talk to you about that for sure. So Grady, you know who our next guest is, right? For next week's Tiger Tuesday?
Eric Deneau, that's
Eric
right.
Deneau. So do you want to talk a little bit about what they're doing and kind of give a little preview?
That'd be
What
awesome.
they're doing over
Yeah.
there?
Gosh, if you all don't know Eric Deneau, you're probably wrong. You probably have been around him. You've probably seen him somewhere. He's active in everything. He's always remodeling a home somewhere. He's, kind of like Chris Munch in that he does that, but he's got a couple of kids. He's always taking them out fishing. You've probably seen him at the lake. He's coaching baseball with his boy. His daughter's into gymnastics. He's a volunteer wrestling coach with the Hayes Wrestling Club. So he's all over the town. You'll see him if you're looking for him. He's a little short fellow, though, so he's easy to miss. He's got a big, giant beard. Heck, he might have shaved that off during quarantine. I'm not even sure. But he's a fantastic faculty member in the Department of Applied Technology. And the patience this man has is unbelievable, given all the other projects he has going on. He doesn't just mentor junior and senior undergrads. He's working with CAM students. He's got kids from Korea. This is their first year in the United States, and he's dragging them to conferences in major U.S. cities to present their research. And I mean, the challenges that come, he didn't have to do that. He does it because he wants to and because he thinks the students will benefit from it, and he's right. And so he's always got a project going. He's a great spokesperson for Fort Hays. He loves it here. He's an alum. If he's not running something at this university in the next few years, I'll be stunned. I mean, he can do whatever he wants. So he'll be a real fun interview, I believe.
Very good. He's definitely going to talk about the national championship that they just won at their conference in Baltimore, among other things. So, and I know that had robotics and all kinds of applied tech applications to it. So I think that'll be a lot of fun. And he's a good guy. He'll be a fun conversation. So I hope you all can join us next week for that. Look for that sign up if you haven't seen it already. And Grady, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for showing up.
And continue to stay safe when you're out there following those crazy storms.
Will do.
Thank you all.